The entire class laughed when Miss Whitmore waved Jonah's attendance sheet like a dirty secret, circling UN excused in red, right after mocking his 7-day absence. He didn't speak. He just stared at the ink bleeding across his name. But when she flipped the page, her smirk vanished. Jonah had written something on the back, and it would change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Jonah McCall stepped into room 208, like a shadow folding into itself. The hallway behind him was alive with slamming lockers and lunchtime chatter. But as he passed through the doorway, it all faded, drowned by the thunder of 30 heads turning in unison. The room fell into a tense hush, until Miss Rachel Whitmore, standing at the front with a dry erase marker in hand, raised an eyebrow and cracked a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Look who finally decided to show up." Her voice carried the crispness of sarcasm, wrapped in authority, and it landed like a slap. The classroom broke into scattered laughter. Quick, nervous, some forced, but none brave enough to look Jonah in the eye. He stood there in his oversized hoodie, eyes low, lips unmoving. The kind of stillness that doesn't beg for attention but dares it.
He didn't flinch, didn't twitch.
He just walked slowly to his desk at the back corner of the room. The same seat he had claimed since the first week of school. It was far enough from the whiteboard to avoid scrutiny, but close enough to the window to pretend he was elsewhere. As he passed each row, a few students lowered their heads, pretending to search for pens or look at notes, unwilling to meet the weight of whatever silence he carried with him. Miss Whitmore made a theatrical show of checking her clipboard. 7 unexcused absences, she said aloud, pretending to scan the attendance sheet. That's a new record. The whiteboard behind her still had yesterday's math problem half erased, but her words were sharp and full of punctuation. Another wave of laughter followed. One boy in the second row snorted. A girl near the window covered her mouth with her sleeve, eyes darting to Jonah, then away. It wasn't personal for them. It was just what they were used to. If Miss Whitmore made someone the punchline, you either laughed or risked becoming the next one. Jonah took his seat slowly, deliberately. He didn't pull out his notebook. He didn't take off his hoodie. He simply sat, hands clasped in his lap, back straight. His face gave away nothing, but the stillness of his body said everything. It was the kind of silence that has already made peace with being misunderstood. He had heard every word, every chuckle. But the part that hit hardest wasn't what Ms. Whitmore said. It was what she didn't bother to ask. No one had wondered why he was gone. Not once. And in those 7 days, everything had changed. Ms. Whitmore continued with the lesson as though nothing had happened, but Jonah's presence sucked the warmth out of the room like an open window in winter. The students felt it. Some shifted in their seats. Others glanced at Jonah expecting some reaction, a response, anything. But he just stared at the clock on the wall, his eyes steady, unblinking. He was counting. Each second was deliberate. Tick, tick, tick. The sound buried itself into his memory, louder than the laughter, heavier than the humiliation. 12 minutes into the lesson, a stack of handouts made its way down the rows. When it reached Jonah, he didn't move. The papers slid to the edge of his desk, untouched. Ms. Whitmore stopped mid-sentence, eyes narrowing. She didn't call him out, not yet, but her glance was a warning. Jonah knew that look. He'd seen it before, in grocery stores, on playgrounds, in the subtle tension of white teachers, with black boys who didn't smile enough. The look that said you will comply. But Jonah wasn't refusing out of rebellion. He was refusing because his soul was tired in a way no child should be. He hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since the ambulance, not since his mother's hand went limp in his. He hadn't told a single soul, not the school, not the neighbor, not the guidance counselor. The weight of the week lived only in him. A private grief, wrapped in silence, hardened into armor. Ms. Whitmore scribbled something onto her clipboard again, this time pressing the pen harder. A red circle formed next to his name. Red meant escalation. Red meant intervention. Red meant a conversation with someone who wouldn't listen but would definitely make notes. The students around him sensed something had shifted. Jonah was always quiet. But this was different. There was no life in his stillness, no curiosity in his eyes, just that endless clock ticking down to something unseen. A few students exchanged looks, unsure if they should laugh again or feel guilty. One girl, Mia, who usually aced every test and sat in the front row, kept glancing back at Jonah, her face clouded with something like confusion. Or was it concern? Ms. Whitmore pushed forward with the lesson, voice louder now, as though volume could outpace discomfort. But the air in the room had thickened. It smelled of something unspoken, a wrongness no one could name. When the bell rang for lunch, the room exhaled relief. Students gathered their things, glad for the break in tension. Ms. Whitmore stepped aside to tidy her papers. Jonah didn't move. He sat there long after the others left, the scraping of chairs and slamming lockers echoing outside the classroom. Alone now, room 208 was quiet, but not empty. The space felt haunted by something recent. The scent of bleach, dry marker ink, and invisible sorrow lingered. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his backpack. It was a drawing, not fresh, creased and faded. It showed a figure curled on a couch, another connected to tubes, and a boy sitting nearby with hollow eyes. The detail was uncanny, heartbreaking. He folded it carefully, tucked it inside a battered notebook, and then finally stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard. Students laughed below, some tossing footballs, others huddled around phones. His world felt 1,000 miles from theirs, and yet he knew something they didn't. Something was coming. He had left something in this school before his 7-day absence. Something he wasn't sure would ever be found. But now it was only a matter of time. He turned from the window and looked up at the clock. Tick, tick, tick. The hand crept past 12:29 p.m. At exactly 12:30, Jonah whispered something under his breath. Only the walls of room 2. He walked out, head high, the shadow of what he carried dragging silently behind him, like a ghost. Jonah looks up at the clock, mentally counting down. He knows exactly what's about to happen next. The following morning brought no reprieve. Room 208 was bathed in the dim blue-gray light of a rainy sky. The kind of weather that made everyone speak softer and move slower. But Ms. Whitmore was energized. She stood at the front of the room like a performer preparing for an audience. The stack of daily attendance sheets clipped to a bright red binder under her arm. The new ink in her pen bled too quickly on the cheap paper. But that didn't stop her from writing Jonah McCall's name with theatrical sharpness. She paused dramatically, eyes aiming the room like a stage actor pausing for effect. Then, deliberately, she scrawled unexcused next to Jonah's name in bold, angry strokes of red. The sound of the marker dragging across the paper echoed slightly in the silent classroom, as though the word itself had weight. She turned around and held the sheet high in the air, as if it were evidence in a courtroom. This, she began, her voice ringing with fake concern and quiet disdain, is what happens when a student doesn't follow the rules. 7 days. No parent call. No doctor's note. No explanation. She didn't need to say his name. Everyone knew who she was talking about. The entire class had seen Jonah's return the day before. They remembered her mocking tone. And now, as she held the paper like a flag of shame, they watched her add layers to his humiliation, brick by brick. Jonah sat motionless in the back, his notebook unopened, the same hoodie shielding his expression. His silence wasn't unfamiliar, but this time, it felt heavier, like a silence lined with barbed wire. Some students laughed quietly again, nudging each other, half embarrassed and half thrilled by the drama unfolding. It was the kind of uncomfortable entertainment that middle school thrived on, so long as it didn't involve them. One boy near the front whispered something, and glanced at Jonah with a crooked smirk. Another girl let out a stifled giggle. Ms. Whitmore didn't stop them. In fact, her posture suggested encouragement. She saw herself not as a teacher, but as a gatekeeper of order, and Jonah in her eyes had broken the unspoken code. From the hallway, the school counselor, Mrs. Delaney, paused by the window on her morning rounds. She peered inside, her eyes meeting Jonah's blank stare for a split second. Something flickered in her face, concern, maybe recognition, but after a brief hesitation, she turned and walked away. The weight of that moment sank like a stone. No one was coming. Jonah was not just alone. He was being watched, studied, judged, but not helped, and he knew it. Ms. Whitmore clicked her pen and scribbled something else in red ink along the margin of the attendance form. It was probably an internal note, a reminder to log the infraction into the school's digital system. She prided herself on being efficient with such tasks. Actions have consequences, she added with finality, like a warning aimed at the rest of the class. We're not running a daycare here. Her words stabbed at something much deeper. She didn't know or didn't care that Jonah had been the daycare, the nurse, the only adult in his home for the past week. While she mocked him for being absent, he had been feeding his mother soup with shaking hands. watching over her as her breathing grew faint, calling 911 when her lips turned blue. He had lived through 7 days of survival that no child should carry alone. But still, he said nothing. Because he had learned that explanations rarely mattered. Not when you looked like him. Not when your hoodie drew more attention than your honesty. Not when teachers used red pens like weapons. The smirk on Ms. Whitmore's face deepened as she flipped the attendance sheet to move on to the next page. And that's when she froze. Her eyes narrowed. There was something scrawled on the back of the form. A faint message. Not visible at first glance, but now unmistakable. Jonah's handwriting in pencil, ghostly and jagged, as if written under duress. She turned it toward the light. It read, 7 days doesn't mean nothing happened. Her mouth parted slightly. The words were messy, urgent, like someone had etched them into the paper in a single breath. There was no explanation, no apology, just that single sentence, enough to crack the floor beneath her smugness. She looked up at Jonah, expecting to see him watching her. But he wasn't. His eyes were closed. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. He sat as though detached from the world, his presence almost spectral. But the message was his. There was no doubt, and its impact unsettled her more than she expected. She lowered the paper, trying to regain her composure. But it was too late. Something had shifted. The authority she wielded so effortlessly now trembled slightly in her hand. The class didn't know what she had read, but they noticed her change in posture, the slight falter, the sudden stiffness. Ms. Whitmore tucked the sheet into her binder and moved on with the roll call, faster now, less theatrical. The room was quiet, confused. The mood had shifted, subtly but decisively. Her control over the narrative, over Jonah's story, had slipped. At the back of the class, Jonah finally opened his eyes. He hadn't written those words out of anger. He wrote them because sometimes, the truth has to bleed through the cracks of silence. He didn't need to raise his voice. He knew his absence had spoken louder than anything he could say out loud. But what Ms. Whitmore didn't know, what no one in the room yet understood, was that those 7 days had left behind something else. Something that couldn't stay hidden much longer. As Ms. Whitmore flips the page, she sees something scrawled on the back. Jonah's handwriting. Her smirk fades. The silence from room 208 followed Jonah like a fog. As he stepped into the hallway, just 2 minutes into the next period, the intercom crackled with Principal Thompson's deep voice summoning him to the office. The tone was formal, rehearsed, calm in a way that meant trouble was waiting. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. Jonah didn't ask to go to his locker. He didn't glance at his classmates. He moved with the quiet steps of someone who knew what it felt like to be accused before being heard. His shoes barely made a sound on the polished tile, but inside the echo of Whitmore's red ink and condescending stare rang louder than any bell. The front office felt colder than usual. The secretary glanced at Jonah without speaking, then motioned toward a closed door. Through the frosted glass, he could see 2 blurred figures inside. Principal Thompson seated at his desk, and someone else standing. As the door opened, the second figure turned. It was Mr. Givens, the vice principal. The moment Jonah entered, the door clicked shut behind him, like a cell. He stood there, not offered a chair, not offered a greeting. Just the 2 adults watching him, one neutral, the other impatient. Principal Thompson's office was lined with framed awards and group photos from pep rallies and district recognitions, all carefully chosen. A plaque near his elbow read, "Leadership, Integrity, Discipline." Jonah stared at it longer than the principal's face. Thompson finally spoke, clearing his throat. "We've received a report from Miss Whitmore regarding your attendance and behavior." Jonah didn't react. Thompson continued. 7 consecutive unexcused absences, and now, reports of classroom disruption, refusal to participate, possible defiance. The word hung in the air like smoke. Jonah tried to respond, but his throat tightened. His lips parted, but no sound followed. His voice had not recovered from the weight of the past week. Too much had gone unsaid for too long. The effort to speak felt like swallowing broken glass. The silence stretched, uncomfortable. Mr. Givens stepped in, arms crossed. He didn't mask his frustration. When students choose to check out of school without explanation, they put their future at risk. "You've already set a pattern, Jonah, and now you're continuing it." Jonah looked at the floor. This wasn't a conversation. It was a sentencing disguised as a meeting. He opened his mouth again. This time a single word broke through, barely audible. That's all he managed before Mr. Givens interrupted. You can explain to the district counselor if necessary. But we're not here to make excuses. We're here to address accountability.
That word again.
Accountability. As if Jonah hadn't been holding the world together for the last week. As if he hadn't been checking his mother's pulse, rationing food, living in silence so that she could sleep through her pain. As if missing school meant he didn't care about school. He felt it all boiling beneath the surface. But there was nowhere to place it. Not in this room. Principal Thompson studied him more carefully now. There was something in Jonah's face that didn't match the report. He wasn't angry. He wasn't combative. He was fractured. Quiet in a way that didn't fit with the narrative of a defiant student. I want to understand, Thompson said, this time softer. But I can't do that if you won't speak. Jonah raised his eyes. There was no fear there. Only a deep, exhausted ache. And then without warning, the principal's office phone rang. It was jarring. Loud. Urgent. Thompson picked it up, turning his chair slightly. His voice shifted to a lower register, murmuring affirmatives as the caller on the other end spoke. He didn't say much, but his expression began to shift. The kind of shift that happens when truth doesn't match assumptions. Jonah watched his brow furrow. His hand stopped tapping the desk. Something on the other end of that call was unraveling the foundation they had built this meeting on. Mr. Givens raised an eyebrow. Principal Thompson asked the caller to repeat one part. Then he leaned back in his chair slowly, the weight of realization sinking in. When he hung up, the room was no longer the same. He turned to Jonah with a look that was not pity, not yet, but definitely no longer skepticism. His next words came carefully. That was a hospital caseworker. Your mother, she's currently admitted at County Medical. ICU. Mr. Givens stiffened. Jonah didn't react. He didn't need to. He had already lived this truth. He didn't need to prove it. Thompson looked at the folder on his desk. The one with the referral forms. The one with intervention written in ink. That now felt cruel. She's been there since last Tuesday? He asked, more to himself than anyone else. Jonah nodded once. The silence returned, but this time it belonged to them, not him. Everything they assumed had just fallen apart. And yet, despite that, Jonah knew this wasn't over. Because even when you tell the truth, the stain of suspicion doesn't wash off that easily. He had already been labeled, and now he had to wonder, would they treat him differently only because a hospital had verified his story? Principal Thompson receives a private phone call. His expression changes as he stares at Jonah in disbelief. The silence in Principal Thompson's office grew too loud to ignore. Jonah sat still, his small frame swallowed by the chair across from the polished oak desk. His eyes had drifted to the corner of the room, unfocused, as if staring through walls. On the desk the phone had gone quiet, but its impact still echoed. The revelation hung in the air like dust in late afternoon light. Lisa McCall, ICU, 7 days. No insurance, no known family, no emergency contact listed with the school. Mr. Givens no longer stood with his arms crossed. He had moved to the window, back turned, pretending to study the parking lot, but his reflection in the glass gave away the shift in his posture. No longer rigid, now uncertain, ashamed, even. Thompson flipped through the student file again, a folder so thin it barely held more than a few disciplinary notes and attendance slips. The system had reduced Jonah to data points: absent, non-compliant, quiet. Nothing in that file told the story of a boy spoon-feeding his unconscious mother in the middle of the night, or calling 911 while praying her lungs would remember how to breathe. Jonah never interrupted them. He sat like a statue, letting the room come to terms with the reality he'd carried silently all week. But inside the memories were loud. The first night it happened, he thought she was just sleeping hard. She'd worked a double shift at the assisted living facility, her second job, and she often came home drained. But when her lips began turning blue and her chest barely moved, Jonah panicked. He didn't know whether to shake her or scream. Instead, he called 911 and whispered into the phone, his voice shaking, telling them his mother wouldn't wake up. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. She hadn't opened her eyes since. The hospital admitted her under emergency protocol, but her lack of insurance complicated everything. She had a rare respiratory condition, undiagnosed, untreated for years because there was never enough money for specialists. Jonah sat alone in the waiting room, that first night watching the fluorescent lights buzz above him like a bad dream. They wouldn't let him stay long. He wasn't old enough to remain overnight. He returned home by himself. He didn't tell a neighbor. He didn't call an uncle because there wasn't one. The house was quiet when he walked back in. The silence tasted different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. For 7 days, he bounced between the hospital and home. He cooked what little food remained in the pantry, stacked dishes that went untouched, and returned to the ICU during visiting hours. He memorized every beeping monitor in his mother's room. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, and counted each breath as if it were his own. He should have told someone, a counselor, a teacher, anyone. But who would have listened? He had learned early that vulnerability made him a target. In 2nd grade, when his shoes were falling apart, he mentioned it to his teacher. The next day, the school called social services. He was pulled from class and interrogated about his living conditions. He had cried when his mother picked him up that day, not from relief, but shame. Since then, Jonah kept everything close to his chest. That silence had become his shield. And now that same silence had been mistaken for defiance. Thompson broke the pause with a long exhale. He looked at Jonah differently now, not with sympathy, but with something closer to disbelief. The kind of disbelief that makes a man question his own assumptions. Still, words failed him. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he finally asked, his voice slow, not demanding but stunned. Jonah didn't answer right away. His stare was distant, his voice low when it finally emerged, almost inaudible. "Because nobody ever asks." That was the truth, even if unspoken, and it landed harder than any excuse. Mr. Givens cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing. Thompson set the folder aside and leaned back, the springs in his chair creaking with age and tension. Jonah's presence now felt different, not like a disruption to manage but a reckoning they had failed to prevent. Then came the knock at the door. 3 taps. Quick, sharp. The secretary stepped inside, eyes darting between the men and Jonah, before handing Principal Thompson a folded piece of paper. He read it once, then again. Without a word, he stood and walked toward the hallway, motioning for Mr. Givens to follow. Jonah sat alone in the office. Minutes passed. The air conditioning buzzed faintly above. A clock ticked on the wall with surgical precision. Then he heard it. Laughter. Not from students, but muffled voices outside. Tires crunching over gravel. Movement near the front of the school. He stood and walked to the window behind the principal's desk, carefully pulling the curtain back just enough to see. There, in the parking lot, was a news van. Local station. The side of it bore the familiar logo he'd seen 1,000 times on television. A reporter stepped out with a cameraman behind her, both of them glancing toward the building. Someone had told them. Jonah's stomach sank. He hadn't spoken publicly. He hadn't shared anything. So who had? It wasn't in his sketchbook. He hadn't texted anyone. The hospital didn't have permission to release details. But someone had made a call. And now, the story he had tried so hard to carry in silence was about to become public. His shame, his privacy, his mother's condition. They would turn it into a headline. He stepped back from the window, heart racing. This wasn't just about school anymore. The world was watching now. A local news van is spotted in the school parking lot. Someone leaked Jonah's story. The video wasn't long, barely a minute. Shaky, secretly recorded under a desk. The frame cutting in and out. But it didn't need perfect lighting or editing. It had something more dangerous. Truth. Whitmore's voice was crystal clear, ringing across the low-quality clip with practiced sarcasm. Look who finally decided to show up. A pause. Laughter. Her tone sliced sharper than the red marker she waved in the air. 7 days. No call, no note. That's a record. The students' laughter echoed like background noise to a crime scene. And at the edge of the frame, only partially visible, was Jonah, head down, body still, a silhouette carrying silence like it was armor. The video wasn't framed to go viral. It just captured something so painfully real that it ignited fury the second it hit social media. Within 6 hours, it had more than 40,000 views. By midnight, it crossed 1 million. The title was bait, and it worked. This teacher mocked a boy for missing school. But watch what happens. People watched, reacted, reposted. The comments section was a battlefield: righteous anger, personal stories, and raw pain. Former students shared similar experiences with teachers who humiliated them for being late, for not having lunch, for failing to bring in signed papers their parents were too broken to care about. Some were crying as they typed. Others were cursing the system. A few even guessed Jonah's name, though it hadn't been revealed. It didn't matter. The feeling was universal. Millions saw themselves in the quiet boy who never answered back. who didn't defend himself, who just sat and took it, because no one in that room had ever asked why he'd been gone. What detonated next wasn't planned. A second post appeared by morning, shared anonymously, a blurry hospital wristband, belonging to Lisa McCall, alongside a timestamp showing she had been admitted to county medical 7 days earlier. No caption, just the raw truth. In the following tweet came a grainy image of Jonah, asleep in a hospital waiting chair, his head tilted to the side, that same hoodie wrapped tight around his chest, like a second skin. Someone had leaked the image, a nurse maybe, or a social worker, but no one claimed it. No credit, just facts. Jonah hadn't been skipping school. He'd been fighting to keep his mother alive. The timeline of humiliation collided violently with the timeline of survival. Now, the story wasn't just about a cruel teacher. It was about a child failed twice. First by a broken system that ignored his silence, and then by the very adult trusted to protect him. The internet didn't move on. It doubled down. Reaction videos were posted by the hour. Artists began drawing Jonah as a silent hero, uploading digital portraits of him holding his mother's hand in an ICU bed, or standing in front of Ms. Whitmore with quiet strength in his eyes. A black student from another state filmed herself crying, saying, "I was Jonah." The video stitched across platforms in seconds. Inside the school, things unraveled quickly. Students stared at Ms. Whitmore in stunned silence during her morning class. The same desks that had once laughed with her now bristled with discomfort. Phones buzzed silently in laps. Some students refused to make eye contact. One girl kept her head down the entire period. Ms. Whitmore continued teaching like everything was normal. But even she felt the difference. The distance, her voice cracked slightly by the second hour. Her pacing more mechanical, her words less confident. The loyalty she had counted on was evaporating. Her control wasn't just slipping, it was gone. She locked her classroom door during lunch and sat at her desk, scrolling through the chaos. News articles had already been published. One headline read, "Viral video of local teacher mocking black student sparks outrage. Boy was caring for hospitalized mother." Her photo was starting to appear next to paragraphs she hadn't authorized. Her past quotes taken out of context, or maybe not. She couldn't tell anymore. Emails poured into her inbox from journalists requesting statements. Her phone wouldn't stop vibrating. She kept muting the notifications, but they kept returning stronger, louder, angrier. Still, she told herself it would pass. That outrage culture was fast-moving. That the district would protect her. But her confidence fractured completely when she received the email marked urgent. It was short, direct, report to the superintendent's office, 3 zeros, no explanation, no support. Just a time. She read it twice, then again, and with each read, meaning deepened. This wasn't going to be a discussion. It was an investigation. She packed her things slowly after the final bell, unsure whether she'd return to 1208 again. As she walked the hallway, she could hear murmurs, feel eyes following her. Even staff avoided her gaze. A few tried to look sympathetic, but no one stopped her. No one said, "You're okay," because deep down, they all saw the video too. They all heard her tone, her laughter, the way she weaponized her position against a child who had lost more in a week than most adults could process in a year. The front doors of the building were no longer a simple exit. As she turned the final corner, she stopped in her tracks. Just beyond the glass, a news van was parked. Cameramen adjusting equipment. A reporter fixing her hair, microphone ready. The school's name clearly visible on the backdrop. They were waiting for her. Someone had tipped them off. She wasn't just a teacher anymore, she was a headline. Ms. Whitmore is summoned to the superintendent's office, and the press is waiting outside. The superintendent's office felt nothing like the rest of the school district building. It was colder, quieter, and almost unnaturally polished. The kind of space where mistakes were not corrected. They were erased. The walls were lined with framed photos of high-achieving students from years past, smiling beneath banners of academic excellence. Yet none of those faces looked like Jonah's. None of them carried the weight he did. And none of those photos prepared Whitmore for the interrogation waiting behind the tall wooden door she hesitated to open. But once she stepped inside, hesitation no longer mattered. Superintendent Marla Kincaid's posture alone announced that this meeting was not a discussion. It was a verdict. Kincaid offered no greeting. Her expression was composed, but her eyes scanned Ms. Whitmore with clinical calculation, as though assessing the liability she represented. To her right sat Leonard Huxley, head of district risk management, whose stack of documents included printed screenshots of the viral video, highlighted comment sections, and a timeline detailing how quickly the story had spread. He barely glanced at Whitmore, his attention fixed on the folder in front of him. The room felt like a courtroom, one where the verdict had been written before the accused entered. The sinking realization settled over her that this was no longer about a single classroom incident. It had become a public crisis, and she was now its epicenter. Before she could sit fully, Kincaid launched into the meeting with a clipped tone that betrayed the strain she was fighting to conceal. She explained that the district was experiencing unprecedented backlash. Parents were calling non-stop. News stations were requesting statements. Advocacy groups were tagging the district in viral threads, demanding accountability. She explained that even the state board had forwarded the video to their equity office for review. Her words came out steady, but each one carried the tremor of institutional fear. This was bigger than humiliation in a classroom. It was a spotlight, cold, unforgiving, and national, and the district was desperate to extinguish it. Huxley opened the crisis folder, pointing to charts and bullet points with the urgency of someone trying to stop a spreading fire. He mentioned phrases like community perception, misconduct optics, and racial sensitivity review triggers. He stressed how dangerous it looked that a white teacher publicly mocked a black student, especially one who, as the public now believed, was caring for a hospitalized mother. He noted how Jonah's silence had become an emotional focal point online, creating a narrative the district couldn't control. The video didn't simply show an unsympathetic teacher. It showed a power structure collapsing around a child's quiet suffering. Every time it was reposted, the district lost the ability to shape the story. For a moment, Ms. Whitmore couldn't speak. She felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, not because she believed she had done something monstrous, but because she recognized how quickly institutions turned on their employees to protect their image. She attempted to explain herself, her voice tightening as she insisted she had followed the attendance policy. She framed her behavior as routine classroom management. She tried to justify the sarcasm as a misguided attempt at humor, but nothing she said pierced the silence, settling over the superintendent and the risk officer. They had already decided that intent no longer mattered. Only perception did. Kincaid leaned forward, hands clasped together, and stated flatly that Ms. Whitmore needed to issue a public apology. Not heartfelt strategic, not reflective, containment-oriented. She explained that the district communications team had crafted a carefully worded statement, expressing sorrow for Jonah's circumstances, while avoiding any direct admission of wrongdoing. It was designed to sound empathetic without inviting litigation. Whitmore was expected to deliver it on camera before the end of the day. No deviations. No improvisation. This wasn't about her dignity or her truth. It was about shielding the institution. The scripted apology slid across the desk toward her like a sealed verdict. But she didn't pick it up. Something inside her hardened, as if refusing to let the district turn her into a pawn. She said, in controlled but trembling frustration, that she shouldn't have to apologize for something she had no way of knowing. She insisted Jonah had given no indication of personal struggles. She claimed that his absence created disruptions, and that she had only pointed out the importance of attendance. She framed herself as another victim, caught in the crossfire of an emotional story spiraling out of context. But the more she rationalized, the colder Kincaid's expression became. The superintendent reminded her that details no longer mattered. Public trust mattered. Community perception mattered. Racial optics mattered. And most dangerously, Jonah's silence mattered. His refusal to speak publicly fueled sympathy, making him untouchable in the court of public opinion. Every hour he remained quiet, the narrative tilted further away from Miss Whitmore. She felt the walls closing in. She had always believed authority protected its own, but now, authority was preparing to sacrifice her to preserve itself. Kincaid offered the final ultimatum. Either she recorded the apology before 6 p.m., or she would be placed on immediate administrative leave, pending investigation. And once placed on leave, the district would have full authority to discipline, suspend, or terminate, based on public pressure. There was no kindness in the words, only institutional strategy thinly disguised as protocol. Whitmore realized then that the district wasn't debating her fate. They were simply warning her of the method they would use to enact it. She left the office with the draft untouched, walking down the long hallway as if moving through water. The building felt unfamiliar now, less a workplace, more a corridor of judgment. Staff avoided her gaze. A custodian paused mid-sweep. Someone from the curriculum office quickly slipped into a room as she approached. Her presence was radioactive. She had become the villain in a story that hadn't even belonged to her until the internet rewrote the script. Across town, however, Jonah sat in the ICU in a room far darker than any school hallway. Machines hummed in slow, steady rhythms, the pale light reflecting off the wires attached to his mother's fragile frame. He had been in the chair beside her for hours without moving. Nurses whispered gently when they entered, their footsteps soft, as though afraid any sound might disrupt the precarious balance keeping Lisa alive. Jonah watched the mechanical rise and fall of her chest. It felt unnatural, like watching someone breathe through borrowed lungs. He tried to process what had happened at school, but every thought dissolved under the weight of his mother's stillness. The outside world, the video, the crowds, the outrage, meant nothing here. Here it was just him and the terrifying reality that the person who had carried him through life might be slipping away. He replayed moments from the week in fractured pieces, cooking for her with trembling hands, holding her steady when she couldn't stand, whispering through tears that help would come. But help had taken too long, and now a machine breathed for her. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the side of the bed, whispering words he didn't have strength to shape. He hoped she heard him, hoped she felt him present even if she couldn't open her eyes. The room felt suspended, as if time itself was afraid to move. Then, without warning, a sharp alarm pierced the quiet. A monitor flatlined for a split second. Then another alarm blared. Nurses rushed into the room, calling out numbers and instructions. Jonah froze as he watched one nurse adjust the ventilator while another signaled for emergency support. Someone mentioned oxygen levels plummeting. Another said her pulse was unstable. Jonah stumbled backward as the curtain was pulled around the bed. He heard the urgent rhythm of gloves snapping on, equipment shifting, commands fired with clinical precision. Then through the narrow space before the curtain fully closed, he saw a nurse begin chest compressions. His mother wasn't breathing on her own anymore. Lisa McCall's condition takes a sudden and terrifying turn in the ICU. While the district scrambled behind closed doors and social media fed on the wildfire of Jonah's silence, one man moved through the halls of that same school unseen, unnoticed, but never unaware. Mr. Carter had been the school janitor for nearly 21 years. Most students didn't know his first name. Most staff didn't bother learning it. But in all those years, Carter had seen everything. The scuffed shoes of kids hiding bruises, the quiet tears wiped off bathroom sinks, the lunch trays filled with untouched food from students too proud to admit they were hungry. He moved quietly, like part of the building's bones, sweeping, locking up, watching, always watching. The morning after the superintendent meeting in Jonah's ICU emergency, Carter stood at the edge of the staff lounge, listening to the whispers behind a closed door. Teachers were talking about the media chaos, the fallout, the statement Ms. Whitmore refused to read. But they weren't talking about Jonah. Not really. They were talking about how it looked, not what it meant. That was the problem. The ones with power were always more concerned with perception than pain. Carter stepped away, quietly descending the back stairwell to the boiler room corridor. He didn't need to hear any more. He already knew something the rest of the school didn't. Something he had kept to himself for weeks out of fear, guilt, and policy. But now, with everything unraveling, staying silent didn't feel like protection. It felt like betrayal. 2 weeks before Jonah's absence, Carter had found something that had disturbed him deeply. It was after hours, nearly 9 p.m., and he had been locking up the West Wing. When he opened the supply storage room near the gym, one that rarely saw use, he found Jonah curled in the far corner on a rolled-up hoodie, fast asleep. A bag of half-eaten crackers beside him, a school-issued Chromebook, closed beside his feet. At first, Carter thought it was a break-in, but when the flashlight caught Jonah's face, and the boy flinched awake in terror, everything shifted. Jonah hadn't explained much. He didn't have to. Carter recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look he'd once seen in his own son. Long ago, that numb, unspoken panic of a child trying not to be noticed because being seen meant being taken away. Carter didn't report it that night. Instead, he brought Jonah a bottle of water, handed him a granola bar from the vending machine stash, and asked if he had somewhere safer to go. Jonah nodded, but it was the kind of nod people give when they're lying to protect what little they have left. The next morning, Carter debated whether to tell someone, a counselor, maybe even the nurse. But when he brought it up gently to a mid-level administrator during their morning check-in, the response stunned him. He was told plainly, "Do not interfere with students off hours unless there is a direct safety threat or written parental consent. Anything else opens the district to liability." Liability. That word had killed more empathy in schools than hate ever could. From that day, Carter watched Jonah a little closer. He started noticing the weight in the boy's walk, the deep circles under his eyes, the way he never quite looked anyone in the face. And when Jonah disappeared for 7 days, Carter knew exactly why, even if no one else asked. Now, with the media circling and the district spinning its story, Carter decided to speak. He didn't go to the press. He didn't call a lawyer. He walked quietly into the main office and asked to speak with the assistant principal, requesting the conversation be documented and recorded. They granted it, reluctantly. In the small windowless meeting room, Carter told them everything about finding Jonah in the supply room, about being told not to interfere, about the policies that discouraged staff from human decency in favor of protocol. His voice didn't shake. His hands didn't tremble. He spoke like a man who had buried too much for too long and now refused to let another child become a line on a report. The administrators nodded stiffly, thanked him, and filed the statement away. But Carter wasn't finished. Before he left, he reached into the inside pocket of his work jacket and pulled out a folded yellowed piece of paper, the same one he had secretly copied weeks ago when cleaning an unattended office. It was a memo, not meant for public eyes, not meant for staff either. It was labeled Internal Policy Reminder, stamped with the district seal, and in fine print it detailed instructions to all school leaders. Discourage unsanctioned student aid that could lead to documentation of housing instability, illness without insurance, or any information that might qualify for state-level intervention. The memo argued that such documentation could trigger mandatory reporting, which the district feared would draw negative scrutiny or legal obligations they weren't prepared to address. In other words, the memo told staff to look the other way, especially when it came to children like Jonah. Mr. Carter slid the copy across the table, leaned back in the chair, and said that this, not the video, not the press, not even Ms. Whitmore, was the real scandal, a system built to protect itself at the cost of children's lives. The room went quiet. There was no form to file for that. No template apology to issue. Just a piece of paper that could unravel everything. Carter stood up, thanked them for their time, and left the room with his head high. He didn't need recognition. He didn't want credit, but he knew the truth had finally been spoken, and this time, it was going to leave a scar. Down the hall, a student aide who had accidentally overheard the entire confession slipped quietly back to the guidance office and texted a screenshot of the memo's title to someone who was already waiting for it. An education journalist tracking the story from the inside. The story was about to detonate all over again. Mr. Carter reveals a shocking school policy memo he secretly copied, one that could destroy careers. The change didn't come with sirens or announcements. It arrived quietly, like fog slipping through open windows, slow, steady, impossible to ignore. In the days following Mr. Carter's revelation, and the leaked memo that had begun circulating online like wildfire, the air in the school hallways turned dense. Students no longer filled the between-class rush with loud conversations and locker slams. Laughter, once careless and easy, had been replaced by something softer, whispers, and within those whispers lived discomfort, questions, and regret. Jonah hadn't returned to school. His absence, once mocked, now loomed like a shadow over every period, every desk, every sentence teachers struggled to deliver. In room 208, his chair remained empty, untouched, unclaimed. Even Whitmore, though still technically active while the district decided her fate, hadn't returned. A substitute teacher sat stiffly at the front of the class now, reading instructions off printed lesson plans, while students barely looked up. But the silence in that room wasn't about the missing teacher. It was about the boy everyone had laughed at and now couldn't forget. Mia Tran, who usually sat in the second row, had stopped wearing headphones between classes. She'd been one of the first to replay the video privately, and notice not just the cruelty of the moment, but the blankness in Jonah's posture, how heavy he looked. She had been the one who snickered when Miss Whitmore joked about breaking records. She had even whispered a follow-up to her friend, something shallow about probably just skipping for video games. Now that memory made her sick. Across the hall, Aiden Parker, a loud, confident kid, known more for his TikToks than test scores, had started walking with his head slightly down. A week ago, he'd laughed loudest when Ms. Whitmore made her comment. He'd even mimicked her voice in the cafeteria that day, drawing giggles and eye rolls. But now, something had shifted inside him. He didn't say much anymore. One morning, he slipped a folded note under the guidance counselor's office door. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. The message was short, written in uneven caps. I was wrong. I laughed at someone who was hurting and now I can't sleep. I want to say sorry, but I don't know how. The guidance counselor didn't need to investigate. She placed the letter in Jonah's file without fanfare. But it became the first of several. Notes started appearing in strange places. One in Jonah's locker, one on his art room chair, one even taped to the underside of his desk. Some were just 2 or 3 lines, unsigned. One simply said, "You didn't deserve that." Another read, "We didn't see you, but now we do." The shift was slow but growing. In the student group chat, usually reserved for memes and weekend plans, a sophomore named Imani posted a suggestion no one expected. She proposed organizing a day of silence in Jonah's honor, not just for him, but for all the kids who showed up to school carrying weight no one ever bothered to ask about. At first the idea sat still in the thread. No one responded, but then someone added a thumbs up, then another, then comments rolled in. "I'm in. We need this. It's time." The plan was simple. One day, no talking. Students would show up, attend class, do their work, but speak nothing, not in class, not at lunch, not between periods. Silence as protest, silence as reflection, silence as recognition for the boy whose own silence had been ridiculed, then heard around the world. By midweek, posters began appearing, not school-approved flyers, but hand-drawn ones taped to walls, lockers, even bathroom stalls. Each one carried the same phrase, 7 days, one voice. Beneath it, the outline of a hooded figure sitting in a school desk. Some students whispered that Jonah's older cousin had designed them. Others said it was a senior from the art club. No one confirmed anything. It didn't matter. The message was spreading. But as the movement grew inside the school, tension tightened outside it. Parents began calling the main office, furious. A small group of them, mostly the same ones who had pushed back on equity lessons last year, labeled the protest political theater and accused the school of indoctrinating students with guilt. One mother marched into the building and threatened to sue if her child was forced to participate in any kind of activism. A father posted a rant on Facebook accusing the district of teaching white students to hate themselves. The superintendent's office was bombarded again, not by outrage over Ms. Whitmore this time, but by complaints about the protest. Kincaid held an emergency meeting with school staff, warning them not to endorse or interfere with the demonstration. Teachers were told to neither support nor obstruct it, to remain administratively neutral. But neutrality had long since collapsed. What the school had seen, what it had ignored, what it had allowed, those things were not neutral. Back in room 208, a substitute teacher quietly continued the lesson, while students said nothing. Their silence wasn't rebellion anymore. It was something closer to mourning. And then, the twist no one expected. Near the end of the final period, one student, a quiet 8th grader named Jordan, who rarely spoke even on good days, reached into the bin under Jonah's desk. He'd been sitting there temporarily while seating was being reshuffled, due to class size. He pulled out a thin black-covered sketchbook, dusty and worn, tucked carefully under a forgotten worksheet. He almost handed it to the substitute, but something stopped him. He opened the cover slowly, unsure why. Inside he found more than drawing. He found pages of raw emotion, charcoal sketches of hospitals, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Ms. Whitmore's mouth stretched into a sneer, classmates drawn faceless in rows. One page was filled with frantic lines, scribbles, shapes, like someone trying to scream through graphite. Another showed Jonah himself, smaller than the classroom around him, drowning in shadows. Some images had words faintly written in the margins, not titles but thoughts. If I talk, they'll twist it. If I disappear, will anyone care? She doesn't know my name, just my file. Jordan froze. The classroom continued in silence, but his world spun. He closed the sketchbook, slowly slid it into his backpack, and raised his hand. What he was about to do next would change everything. A student finds Jonah's sketchbook, and what's inside reveals everything he couldn't say out loud. The discovery of Jonah's sketchbook didn't spread with noise. It bled through the school like a quiet ache. It began with a single page copied and posted to a student-run forum, then another, then an entire PDF scanned by the school's art teacher after the substitute handed it in for safekeeping. No official statement accompanied it. No one from the administration stepped in to claim the act. But in less than 12 hours, Jonah McCall's private sketchbook had become a national artifact, both proof of suffering and a mirror held up to an American school system that had failed to ask, "Are you okay?" The images weren't polished or pretty. They were raw, unfinished, and immediate, as if drawn mid-panic, mid-silence, mid-collapse. Some pages were in charcoal, others scratched in faded pencil. There was no consistency in layout, no regard for symmetry or framing. But that was the power of it. The art didn't ask for praise. It demanded to be seen. On one page, a hospital bed hovered in the center, wires sprawling out like spider legs. A single figure lay in it, his mother drawn with closed eyes, a breathing mask exaggerated like a bird's beak, both foreign and fragile. Above her, a clock melted across the ceiling, and underneath the image, in light pencil, Jonah had written, "I count her breaths more than I count my grades." Another sketch revealed a stark kitchen scene. An empty refrigerator with its door ajar, nothing inside but a crumpled juice box, and 2 condiment bottles. The background blurred into scratch marks. On the corner of that page, in tight cursive, it said, "Silence at home is louder when your stomach is empty." But it wasn't just home that haunted his pages. The school appeared too, its hallways distorted, stretching into impossible angles. A desk floated in the air, surrounded by faceless students, and in the middle sat Jonah, head lowered, arms locked tight across his chest. Above him, red X's hovered where words should have been. In another piece, Miss Whitmore stood at the front of a warped classroom, her arms pointed outward like daggers. Her mouth was drawn as a megaphone. Most chillingly, her eyes were covered with blindfolds, and behind her, barely visible in the graphite blur, were faint horns drawn on her head. That image, Miss Whitmore with devil horns blindfolded and barking over Jonah's silhouette, was the one that lit the fire. It spread first through student channels, then through art forums, then into mainstream platforms. People didn't just repost it, they wrote essays, made reaction videos, designed t-shirts. Activists called it the Whitmore page. Art critics hailed it as visual protest in its purest form. But more importantly, viewers everywhere began asking the same question. How could no one have seen him? Media outlets picked it up next. A segment on national television labeled Jonah the silent voice of America's neglected black children. Anchors debated the systemic failings exposed by the sketchbook. An education reporter described the artwork as a chilling map of quiet trauma, institutionalized in plain sight. Local newspapers ran op-eds with titles like "The Sketchbook That Shamed a School District" and "When Discipline Silences Grief." The school's administration went into crisis mode again. But this time, the damage wasn't based on assumptions or leaks. It came directly from Jonah's hand. They couldn't bury it, couldn't spin it. His art spoke in a language that wasn't afraid of being interrupted. It didn't wait to be called on. It simply told the truth. For students, Jonah's sketches became more than art. They were proof that someone like them, someone quiet and unnoticed, had screamed without a voice, and been heard anyway. In classrooms, printed copies of certain pages were passed like contraband. One student from the junior class painted a hallway mural inspired by Jonah's sketch of the warped school. It was later taken down by order of the administration, but photos of it went viral within minutes. Another student wrote a poem titled "You Never Saw Him," and left it taped to every locker on one hallway before the bell rang. But amid the chaos, Jonah remained silent, still absent from school, still unseen in person. His mother, still unconscious, had been placed under deeper observation after the ICU scare. Jonah remained at her bedside, unaware of just how loud his silence had become. Reporters attempted to reach him through the hospital, through his school, through online channels. None succeeded. His social media remained inactive. Even the art teacher who had known him best said Jonah had always been distant. But now, his absence felt like a protest all its own. And yet, somewhere between the sketchbook's virality and the district's unraveling, an invitation arrived. It came in an envelope, hand-delivered to the hospital, not emailed, not leaked, not public. Inside was a letter from the State Board of Education, inviting Jonah to speak at their upcoming policy review hearing on student equity and mental health practices. The board, aware of the national attention surrounding his story, wanted him to offer a youth perspective. They weren't asking for an apology or a rehash of the scandal. They were asking him to share his truth, in his words however he wanted. The letter sat on the tray table beside his mother's bed for nearly 2 days before he touched it. When he finally opened it, he didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply read it, folded it back, and left it there, untouched. He didn't want to speak. Not to them. Not to the people who let someone like Ms. Whitmore remain in power. not to officials who only paid attention once the world forced them to. Jonah had already spoken. In pencil. In shading. In silence. He had no desire to become someone's symbol. No interest in being paraded in front of politicians looking to soften their image. But everything changed when the board released its speaker list. On the third page of the program, buried under 3 state officials and 2 education lobbyists, was a name Jonah hadn't seen since the day his world broke. Rachel Whitmore. She had been invited too. As a representative of traditional disciplinary practice in underfunded public schools, Jonah stared at the name for a long time. The irony was nauseating. The woman who silenced him now being asked to speak on behalf of student discipline, as if she were the victim. As if her voice were the one worth protecting. He didn't make a scene. He didn't scream or tear the paper apart. He simply folded the letter one last time and placed it into his sketchbook. That night, he sat beside his mother in the dim hospital light and flipped to a blank page. He began to draw, not because he had to, because the time for silence was ending. Jonah is invited to speak at the state education board, but he refuses. Until he sees one name on the panel. The district tried to contain the scandal, but it had already grown roots in places no one could reach. What began as a disciplinary crisis had evolved into a cultural reckoning, and Miss Rachel Whitmore found herself at the center of something far darker than bad press. It wasn't just the sketchbook anymore. It was the question that came next. Who was she really? The answer didn't come from a press release or a formal investigation. It came from a journalist named Daria Kent, a relentless education reporter with a reputation for peeling back layers the system preferred hidden. Daria had been following the Jonah McCall case for weeks, not because of the school's official statements, but because something about Ms. Whitmore's tone in the viral video felt too practiced, too confident, too habitual, so she dug deeper. It started with public records, college transcripts, court filings, archived disciplinary logs. Buried in the student affairs database of an out-of-state university was an old incident report. It dated back 15 years. The report stated that Rachel Whitmore had been placed on academic probation during her sophomore year for an incident involving racially charged remarks made during a student government election. The logs were vague, intentionally, but one statement stood out. A professor had noted, student displays patterns of authority-challenging behavior when questioned on race-related topics. That was the first crack. The second came from a yearbook photo. Her father, Harold Whitmore, deceased, a decorated Vietnam veteran turned local business owner in rural Georgia. He had run for city council in 1995 and lost, but his campaign slogan resurfaced in old forums archived online. Preserve the past, protect our people. What Daria found next chilled her. Harold had once spoken at a rally for a known white nationalist group. The footage pixelated and buried on a fringe archive site. It showed him standing on a makeshift platform, clutching a megaphone, talking about taking schools back and disciplining disrespectful youth. The clip never went mainstream, but now with Rachel Whitmore's name trending, someone dug it up, and Daria confirmed the connection. The article hit the wire mid-morning. The roots of silence, Rachel Whitmore's family ties to white nationalism and college disciplinary record. The school district was blindsided. Parents were horrified, and the community, already wounded by the image of a black child humiliated in a classroom, now saw that humiliation in a new, more damning light. But while the world reacted, Miss Whitmore sat alone in her classroom, suspended but still returning to the empty room that once gave her purpose. Room 208 had become her purgatory, stripped of students, stripped of rhythm. The clock still ticked, the walls still stood, but nothing inside the space felt alive anymore. She had read the article, every line, every quote, and though she wanted to deny it, rage against it, she didn't. She simply sat behind her desk, staring at the locked drawer on the right, the one no one had ever opened, the one she hadn't touched since her second year of teaching. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the key. The drawer creaked open slowly, like something resisting being remembered. Inside was a single photo, the corners worn and soft. It showed a boy with a mischievous smile and shaggy blonde hair, mid-laugh, arms flung around Rachel's shoulders. Her younger brother, Caleb. Caleb had died at 19. The obituary said accidental overdose. But Rachel knew it wasn't that simple. Caleb had spiraled after being expelled from his senior year of high school. A cafeteria fight. One moment, he had shoved a black student after an argument during lunch. The school had made an example of him. Local media called it racially motivated. Their father exploded, saying the school had turned its back on their own. The rhetoric in their house became even more bitter, more dangerous. Rachel remembered standing on the stairs, overhearing her father yell that reverse racism was the real threat. She hadn't said anything then. She didn't argue. She never challenged him. Not once. And after Caleb's death, she never unpacked what role that silence played. Instead, she buried it, went into teaching, thought she could prove she wasn't like him, that she could rebuild her identity inside a classroom. But she hadn't escaped it. She'd carried it in her tone, in her judgments, in the cold, clipped sarcasm she used with Jonah. The same voice her father once used at the dinner table when he talked about those kinds of kids. The shame of it settled into her skin like frost. She placed the photo back in the drawer, but didn't lock it this time. She didn't want to hide from herself anymore. She closed the lid gently, feeling the slow weight of everything she had ignored. Then came the notification. Her laptop chimed once. She hesitated. It was an email, no subject line, no address she recognized. But the name in the sender line made her heart stop. Jonah McCall. She opened it. There were no greetings, no accusations, just 3 short paragraphs. Jonah said he wasn't writing to forgive her. Forgiveness, he explained, was not something he owed. He said he wasn't trying to answer questions either, because her curiosity didn't erase his pain. But he was writing for one reason, because he knew what it felt like to carry silence until it broke you. He told her that he had seen pain on her face when she read his sketchbook page. Not guilt, not pity, but something different. Recognition. And that scared him more than anything else. Because it meant she knew what she was doing, and did it anyway. Then came the final line. You weren't cruel because you didn't understand. You were cruel because you thought no one would call you out for it. She closed the laptop slowly, like someone trying to keep a wound from bleeding. And for the first time since this began, she cried, not out of fear for her job, not from public disgrace, but because a child who had every reason to hate her had just handed her the one thing she'd avoided her entire life. The truth. She opens her email. Jonah has written to her. And what he says breaks her. The email had shaken her, but it was the letter that broke her. The next morning, Ms. Whitmore returned to '08, not as a teacher, not as an authority figure, but as someone trying to confront the ruins of who she'd become. The air in the classroom was still, heavy with something unspoken. The light from the windows looked different, sharper, colder. Her steps slowed the moment she crossed the threshold, as if her own presence in that space had become a kind of trespass. She placed her bag on the desk, not with the usual practiced routine but with hesitation, her fingers brushing the worn wood, as though hoping it might remember better days. Days before the video, before the sketchbook, before the unraveling. Her eyes drifted to the seat Jonah once filled, now occupied by silence. Nothing had been moved. The desk was untouched, as if time had paused itself around that one spot. She thought back to the final words of his email, and something inside her chest pulled tight. But that email, raw as it was, wasn't the full story. Later that afternoon, a second envelope had arrived, not digitally, but by hand. A school security officer had brought it in, saying it was delivered to the front desk with instructions not to scan or copy it. It was handwritten, sealed. The name on the front, Ms. Whitmore. She hadn't opened it immediately. Something about the weight of it, the shape of his handwriting, made her freeze. She waited until the hallway emptied, and the silence felt safe. Then she peeled it open, slowly, her hands trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. What she read undid her in ways nothing else had. Jonah's letter was unlike anything she expected. It didn't rage. It didn't plead. It didn't list demands or accusations. It was something else, quiet, devastating, and mature in a way that made her question every assumption she'd ever made about him. His words carried grief like a current, but they also carried clarity. Each sentence layered years of burden into a few lines. He explained that what happened in room 28 wasn't just about her, and it wasn't just about him. It was about the entire experience of being a young black boy in a world where you were either invisible or criminal, never just human. He wrote about what it meant to walk through life being constantly judged for your expression, your silence, your hoodie, your tiredness, your presence. He described the ache of being looked at without being seen, of answering questions that were really accusations, and he wrote, with haunting precision, how her voice, sharp, public and dismissive, had sounded just like all the others he'd learned to flinch from. But then, the letter turned. He said he forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because he refused to carry her hate in his chest like a second heart. He explained that hate, when absorbed, doesn't just bruise, it metastasizes. It changes your voice, makes your silence heavier, makes your art darker, and he wouldn't give her that power. He needed space in his chest for his mother, for healing, for the sound of his own breath without shame. He ended the letter not with pity or poetry, but with a line that felt like thunder beneath paper. If no one had watched that video, would you still think you did nothing wrong? She read that line over and over, and in that question she saw the core of everything she had refused to examine. Because the truth was, she hadn't just humiliated him, she had done it thinking no one would care. And when they did, only then had she begun to unravel, not from guilt but from exposure. That's what haunted her now, not that she had made a mistake, but that she might never have corrected it if no one had been watching. Her entire career, her entire identity, had been built on the assumption that she was fair, that her standards were colorblind, that students like Jonah needed discipline, not sympathy. And yet all along, she had used her authority as a weapon wrapped in policy, disguising cruelty as structure, and sarcasm as tough love. She folded the letter and placed it inside her top drawer, but its presence remained like a heartbeat. She didn't teach that day. The district hadn't cleared her to resume instruction, and she wasn't sure she'd ever truly stand at the front of a classroom again. She simply sat in the room and let herself feel the weight of everything she hadn't felt when it mattered. Not when he was missing. Not when he returned. Not even when she mocked him. Now it all returned at once, crashing over her in waves that didn't ask permission. Outside, the building buzzed as usual. Announcements echoed through the PA system. Students shifted between periods, but inside room 208, time folded in on itself. She had thought the video was her downfall. She was wrong. This letter, because it didn't expose her publicly, it confronted her personally. It made her see herself through the eyes of someone she had harmed, and then dismissed. And that was a mirror she could no longer look away from. When the final bell rang, she remained in her seat for several minutes, unsure whether to gather her things or stay seated, and let the stillness punish her a while longer. But then, something pulled her back into motion, a sense quiet but urgent, that something else was coming. As she stood, she walked to the door, and peeked into the hallway. Students were moving in a stream toward the exit. Nothing seemed unusual at first, until she noticed the shirts. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. Each student wore black. Some wore full black hoodies, others had simply pulled on black t-shirts over their uniforms. But every shirt bore a red hand-drawn outline of a boy sitting at a desk with his head down, and the words printed across every chest in sharp white letters. I was here. She froze. Some students made eye contact with her. Some didn't. But none of them smiled. None of them laughed. It wasn't mockery. It was declaration. It was confrontation. It was a hallway of young people forcing her to face what she'd ignored. The echo of Jonah's letter returned to her mind. If no one had watched, would you still think you did nothing wrong? Now, they were all watching. Ms. Whitmore walks into her classroom and sees every student wearing something that forces her to confront herself. The next morning, room 208, transformed from a place of memory into a place of meaning. Students filed in one by one, their faces unreadable, their movements synchronized by something deeper than coordination, shared purpose. But it wasn't what they wore that stopped Whitmore cold. It was what they had replaced them with. They entered not in school clothes, but in pale blue hospital gowns, real ones, the kind that tie behind the back. Some had been borrowed, others thrifted, others handmade with stitching and paint. The students moved slowly, solemnly, creating an eerie procession as they took their seats. They said nothing. They didn't look at her. They didn't look at each other. They simply filled the room like shadows returning to the scene of a crime. Across each back, written in thick, angry red marker, were two words: 7 days. The words weren't printed neatly. They bled unevenly across the fabric, some crooked, some smeared, and that imperfection only made them louder, because they weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be felt. Mrs. Whitmore stood at the front of the room, still gripping her lesson plan, her voice forgotten somewhere between her throat and her spine. She didn't speak. She couldn't. This wasn't her classroom anymore. It belonged to them now. Even the ones who had laughed. Aiden, Mia, the others. They wore gowns too, some with their heads slightly bowed, some sitting upright like they were trying to atone with posture alone. The room fell into a silence so deep it felt alive, like the space itself had joined in protest. The substitute entered late, pausing the moment he saw the sea of blue gowns. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then changed his mind. He left without a word. No one followed. Miss Whitmore remained standing, unsure what to do with her hands, her face, her existence. She looked at Jonah's empty seat, still vacant, still sacred, and then at the sea of students now occupying the space he had once tried to survive in. Every one of them had become him. The lesson plan in her hands felt suddenly absurd. She dropped it. The pages scattered. Still no one moved. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged. It was refusal. It was reversal. For years they had sat quietly while teachers spoke, tested, judged. Now, the roles were inverted. Miss Whitmore was the one being watched, studied, evaluated, not by administrators but by the very students she had once commanded with ease. The stillness dragged on, time stretching and looping around itself. And just when it felt like the moment couldn't hold any more weight, someone stood. It was a girl from the back, quiet, usually invisible. She didn't say a word. She simply walked to the front, pulled a folding chair beside the whiteboard, and sat facing Miss Whitmore. Then another student stood, then another until 5, then 10, then nearly the entire class sat facing her, not with rage, but with presence, a human mirror of what she had once failed to see. They weren't there to argue, they weren't there to forgive, they were there to make sure she never forgot. The rest of the day passed like that. Other classrooms caught on. More students arrived in hospital gowns. More red 7 days scrawled across their backs. Some wore it on jackets. Some painted it on their backpacks. By lunch, nearly half the school was dressed in protest. Teachers didn't stop them. Some cried quietly behind closed doors. Others watched from doorways, their faces unreadable. A few even joined them, standing in hallways, saying nothing, mourning the times they'd looked away. The media caught it almost instantly. Images flooded social media, dozens of students sitting in silence, facing the front of classrooms, like statues of grief. Journalists called it the walk-in. Hashtags trended. Parents divided. Some praised their kids for being brave. Others accused the school of radicalizing them. But the students didn't care. This wasn't for the headlines. It was for Jonah. At the hospital, the news reached the ICU waiting room. A nurse showed Jonah a photo on her phone. A blurry shot of room 208. Every seat filled with gowns, his desk still empty, still untouched. Jonah stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't speak, but his eyes changed. Something cracked open in them. Not relief, not pride, but recognition. Seen him, really seen him, and that meant he wasn't invisible anymore. He folded the nurse's phone back into her hand and returned to his seat beside his mother's bed. The machine still clicked. The IV still dripped. The soft mechanical rise and fall of her chest continued. Fragile, machine-fed, but consistent. She hadn't woken up, but her vitals had stabilized. That was more than he'd had days ago. He reached for his sketchbook again. There were still pages left, still things he hadn't drawn. He turned to a blank sheet, stared at it, and then began sketching the hospital gowns. Not in protest but in gratitude. Each figure was faceless but standing. Each one holding up a blank sign, not to yell, but to carry. That's how the protest lived, not through volume, but through weight. Then, without warning, the machine beside the bed beeped. Jonah looked up. It wasn't the regular rhythm. It was something else. Short, irregular. The monitor alarm cracked through the quiet hospital room. Nurses rushed in, moving with practiced urgency. Another staff member followed. Jonah stepped back as they adjusted wires, checked vitals. He wasn't panicking, not yet, but something felt different. Then they called a code. He froze. He'd heard that phrase before. The lights above flickered. A rapid response team arrived. Jonah stood in the hallway now, watching them close the curtain, watching his mother vanish behind it. He felt the floor shift beneath him, the ground no longer steady. The memory of her voice flooded him, not just what she had said, but what she hadn't gotten the chance to say. A nurse placed a hand gently on his shoulder. He didn't brush it away. He just looked at the curtain, waiting, praying, fearing. And then, the curtain opened. The bed was empty. No one would tell him why. Lisa McCall's hospital bed is empty. No one knows why. The hospital corridor outside room 312 hummed with tension. Emergency lights flashed red for a moment. then died. A team of nurses and a respiratory technician hovered over the bed where Lisa McCall had lain motionless, just minutes before. The ventilator's soft beep had been replaced by frantic monitors. The air in the room smelled of antiseptic, tears, and fear. As the curtain parted and staff cleared the way, the bed stood empty, the machines scraping softly in their wake. For a heartbeat, the hospital felt hollow, as though it had exhaled without knowing where the breath had gone. Inside the control room, a nurse on duty froze. The oxygen supply log blinked on her screen, showing a warning. NSUF, no insurance. According to policy, once a patient reached a certain threshold of unpaid days, extended high-flow oxygen could be discontinued until insurance or payment arrangements were confirmed. A red-lined protocol, dry on paper, cold in execution. The nurse felt her chest tighten. She knew what the protocol meant. She also recognized the color of the file. It was beneath the threshold for ones they usually let go. A black family, underinsured, in emotional collapse, and now almost vanished from the bedsheet. But she refused to let the policy win. She moved across the floor with quiet determination. Step by step, she traced the oxygen tubing, checked the machines, and reset the ventilator's override switch. She tapped the screen that controlled the monitor alarms, and silenced the automated prompt, "Extend service with payment confirmation." She left a short note in the digital log. Override invoked, patient at risk, but left out her name. She didn't want credit, she just wanted survival. Back in the hallway, Jonah paced on knees, head bowed, one hand rubbing his forehead, the other pressed against his mother's pillow. He watched the flutter of nurses' jackets through the glass, heard clipped orders, suppressed sobs. When the door finally opened again, the same nurse stepped out, her expression exhausted but resolute. Her eyes caught his as if saying without words, "She's alive now. Don't lose her again." Jonah nodded, almost unconsciously. He felt the world shift beneath him, as though for a second he lived not in tragedy, but in fragile hope. Inside, they returned to the room. The ventilator's rhythm resumed. Slow, mechanical, but consistent. The monitors beeped steady once more. The nasal cannula clung gently to Lisa's face, feeding oxygen into lungs that, just minutes earlier, had failed to rise. A doctor, a young resident, checked her pulse, then glanced at the chart. His face betrayed the internal conflict. The note said, "Emergency override, but no insurance." He exhaled, forced a nod, then stepped out, leaving the breathing machine to hum quietly. For hours, Jonah sat beside her. The thin hospital blanket felt cold between them. His sketchbook lay open on the bedside table, pages fluttering slightly under the hum of the AC. Outside the ICU window, the dark sky lightened. Hospital corridors remained silent, except for distant calls and the occasional rolling of carts. And through it all, Lisa's chest rose and fell. Rise, fall, rise, fall, a breath once more belonging to her. It wasn't a return to health. It was a return to the possibility of life. When morning came, a shift nurse checked her eyes for signs of consciousness. They were dim, unfocused, but they were there. A flicker, maybe a memory, maybe just the brain restarting. She stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering, a weak hand reaching toward the side rail. At that moment, Jonah exhaled long and low. Gratitude didn't rise. It settled, heavy, slow, grounded. He closed the sketchbook, his shoulders sagging. The fight wasn't over, but they had bought time. Time enough, maybe, to find justice. The news of Lisa's survival leaked. Not by hospital PR, but by the nurse who had overridden the policy. She whispered the story softly to a coworker in the corridor. Enough to reach sympathetic ears, enough to spark outrage behind closed doors. Within 24 hours, word had reached a local community health advocate. She called an emergency meeting. Under whispered discussions, they began to piece together facts. A black family denied care, a ventilator shut down, a nurse breaking protocol to save a life. The name McCall grew heavy. The hospital administration scrambled, shifting blame onto unavoidable policy. But the records, oxygen override log, time-stamped monitor alerts, refused to disappear. At home, the arrival of a lawyer disrupted the fragile calm. The knock had come early, before breakfast when Jonah was running out for coffee and quiet thoughts. Through the peephole, he saw a black suit, a fat envelope held tight. He hesitated. That morning he wasn't going to school. He was visiting his mother. But the lawyer said she had something important to deliver for legal reasons. Inside was a letter on official letterhead, stamped with his name at the top. The words inside were simple but heavy. Potential class action lawsuit. Systemic rights violation. Demand for accountability. Nothing in the letter was about money. It was about change. About forcing the hospital, and by extension every institution that looked the other way, to acknowledge what they'd almost taken. It referenced the death certificates of other patients, statistical reports showing patterns, Black and uninsured patients deprived of extended care, ventilator overrides quietly invoked, families never informed. It named the nurses' anonymous override record, hospital code logs, oxygen supply audits, and it offered Jonah a chance, not for revenge, but for a platform to transform tragedy into exposure. Jonah held the letter in both hands. The paper trembled slightly against his palms, but his eyes were stable. He realized that survival wasn't enough anymore. Not for his mother. Not for all the mothers whose beds had been emptied without warning. Without note. Not for all the silent children who slept in school closets because the world outside their homes was empty. He felt the weight of the coming storm. The letter was a key. To truth. To accountability. To justice. But opening that door meant everything could change. For better or worse. Inside the hospital, the ventilator beeped steadily. Lisa's hand twitched again. Her breath, once ghost-thin, now steady. She had cheated death, but the system that nearly let her die remained intact. And now a single unsigned letter threatened to expose the cracks in that system. As the sun set over the city, Jonah sat beside her, reading through the legal pages again. The words no longer felt foreign. Each paragraph was a reflection of all the times he had been invisible, of every silent scream, every hollow classroom, every threat unspoken because no one asked. He closed the letter. His fingers brushed the sketchbook lying on the bed beside him. The pages were filled with pain, but also with memory, the memory of silence finally speaking. He didn't speak to his mother. He didn't pack for court or media. He simply sat, waiting, watching, breathing. Because now, the battle wasn't just for oxygen or justice. It was for recognition, for truth, for change. A lawyer arrives at the McCall home, with a letter that could change Jonah's future forever. The morning the law firm's letter arrived, the world felt colder in the McCall house. The envelope lay on the kitchen table beside a half-finished sketch of Lisa McCall, the same drawing Jonas had started weeks ago, before the hospital, before the media, before the firestorm. The light through the kitchen window seemed dimmer, gray-toned, as if the sun itself hesitated to shine on what was about to unfold. Jonas stared at the letter for minutes before he dared to touch it. The paper was thick, stamped with the seal of a prominent civil rights law firm, and addressed not just to him but to his mother and to the memory of every child silenced by neglect. Inside, the letter laid out their offer: full representation, at no cost, for any legal actions needed to challenge both the school district and the hospital. It enumerated grievances, emotional trauma, negligent institutional policies, racial bias under the guise of discipline, unlawful denial of health care, and potential malpractice in the ICU override incident. The language was sharp, precise, professional. It claimed years of precedent, millions secured for families in similar situations. It offered security, it offered money, it offered closure for some. Jonas closed his eyes. The idea of a settlement, a check, it felt like a trap. He remembered the cold red letters on the hospital gowns. 7 days. He remembered the chairs of classmates sitting silent, still. He remembered his mother's chest rising and falling, slow but alive. A check, he realized, could buy them silence. It could feel like justice, but taste like betrayal. He placed the letter carefully on the counter, beside the sketches and hospital bills. He shook his head slowly. He couldn't do it. Not yet. Not like this. Not for a payout. He wanted something bigger. Not pity. Not temporary relief. He wanted policy. He wanted change. Later that afternoon, he sat beside his mother's bed. The law firm letter unfolded on the tray table. The ventilator's rhythmic hum filled the small room. Outside, the hospital corridor echoed with the distant roll of carts, the shuffle of nurses' shoes. Through the window he could see the tops of distant buildings bathed in fading gold. He traced the words of the letter with his finger. "We seek systemic reform, not compensation." He wrote those words into his sketchbook's blank margins. Beneath them he sketched a gavel, half-shadowed, as if poised over the entire district. He imagined every child who had ever felt invisible, those sleeping in closets, hiding hunger, nursing grief in silence. seeing that gavel move. He imagined the hold that institutions had on them, shuddering under its weight. He closed the sketchbook gently, like closing a wound that refused to heal unless reopened. He didn't slide the letter into a drawer, didn't fold it neatly. He left it on the tray, open, letting the world know it existed. At home later, Jonas's foster, a distant cousin, who had taken them in temporarily after Lisa's crisis, entered the room. She paused by the door, eyes flicking from sketchbook to letter. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. She sat beside Jonas and folded her hands in her lap. The weight of that letter settled between them. She nodded slowly, no words needed. She understood. In the days that followed, whispers began in the neighborhood. A local community organizer visited their porch, a woman who worked with underfunded schools and underserved families. She said she had heard about the McCalls, about the ICU scare, about kids in gowns, sitting in classrooms in protest. She said the law firm's involvement might change everything, bring attention beyond the district, reach media outlets that seldom cared about just another black family. She offered to gather witnesses, former students, parents, healthcare workers who had seen bias, neglect, paperwork buried in drawers, payments delayed until patients died or gave up. She said if they're going to look away, we'll make sure everyone sees. Jonas felt his pulse hammer. This was bigger than anger, than grief, than fear. It was accountability. Real accountability. Not statements, not apologies, not resignations, but restructuring, systems reviled, publicly rewriting rules, better oversight, transparent records, protections for students like him, protections for patients like his mother. But almost immediately the district responded. A letter came on uniform letterhead. From the school's attorney. It offered a settlement, not an admission of guilt, not a policy rewrite, not acknowledgement of negligence, just a payment. Enough, they implied, to make this quietly go away. They framed it as a goodwill gesture, a check, privacy terms, a clause for an amicable resolution. Teachers who had been silent before received memos. No public commentary, no participation in protests, no sharing internal documents. Parent-teacher associations received calls, reminders of community image, the risk of lawsuits. The phrasing was careful, clinical, cautious. It reeked of fear. Jonas looked at the settlement offer, then at the letter from the civil rights firm. He imagined the weight of both. One side, easy exit, quick silence, no headlines. The other side, a long fight, painful exposure, legal battles, community pressure, unknown consequences. This path could change everything. The other could bury everything under a hush of money. He folded both letters, stacked them side by side on the kitchen table, and covered them with a plain notebook. He stepped away, leaving the papers out for whoever came next. His mother, the cousin, the organizer. Let them choose. But he knew. He had already decided. Days passed. The local media, once fixated on student protests, viral videos, sketchbook art, caught wind of the pending lawsuit. Anchors mentioned possible class action suit against the district for systemic negligence and racial bias. Social media erupted again. Some comments praised the McCalls for standing up. Others decried them. Why drag an entire school under one child's hardship? Too political. Where does it end? Some parents threatened to pull their kids out. Others whispered about protests, lawsuits, ruined reputations. Inside classrooms, unease returned. Teachers glanced over shoulder. Administrators walked halls more often. Students passed notes. Eyes haunted. The substitute in room 208 didn't enter that day. A security guard blocked the door. Reason: maintenance. Rumors spread that the room was being repainted before reopening. But the smell of latex might not erase the memory. Then, late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and streetlights cast long shadows across suburban lawns, a formal notification arrived at the district office. The board chair, someone who had once praised traditional discipline, outdated attendance policies, and teaching respect, was suddenly out of reach. Rumors spread fast: health issues, personal reasons, preemptive resignation. But the timing was suspicious. The letter came the same night the law firm filed the initial complaint. Inside the walls of bureaucratic offices, things moved. Documents shuffled. Files opened. Internal memos, previously hidden, were delivered to lawyers. Resignation letters appeared. Papers changed color under the flicker of fluorescent lights. Old attendance policies, Absence guidelines, disciplinary procedures, surfaced in digital logs, time-stamped for years past. Names appeared, signatures, deadlines never met, promises never kept. For the McCalls, watching all this felt surreal. The storm they had unleashed had begun unraveling the district's oldest defenses, but with each crack, the risk grew. Exposure meant backlash, fighting meant targets. Their faces, once hidden behind gowns and hospital scenes, were now center stage. They had no idea what would come next. Late one night, Jonah sat at the kitchen table, under a single bulb's halo, legal letter in hand, sketchbook beside him. He traced the edges of both again. He thought of his mother's shallow breaths, now steadied by machines. He thought of the hospital nurse who had saved her life, acting against policy. He thought of the classmates in gowns, silent, powerful, defiant. He thought of the lawyer waiting to file the suit. He thought of the board chair whose role suddenly vanished. And he felt something unfamiliar but fierce. Not anger, not revenge, not even hope, because hope was fragile, unpredictable. No, he felt determination, a resolve that the truth would not be a moment, that justice would not be a check, that silence would not be currency. He placed his hand over the legal letter in his sketchbook, pressing down lightly. The papers didn't crumple, the wood of the table didn't crack, but inside him something settled. A promise made not to any institution, but to the memory of his mother, to every child forced silent in halls like room 208, and to himself, because this was more than a case. This was history. The school board schedules an emergency meeting, and a resignation is rumored. The auditorium lights dimmed. A soft hum of whispered conversation drifted across the rows. Journalists checking cameras, district officials shifting in seats, educators from dozens of states scribbling notes. On stage, a single spotlight hovered over a modest wooden podium, clean, unadorned, almost humble. Behind it, the banner read, National Forum on Equity in Education. For many in the crowd, it was just another panel, until a shy 13-year-old black boy named Jonah McCall stepped forward. Jonah's entry was quiet, almost understated. He walked slowly, hands folded in front of him, head level, eyes scanning the audience only briefly before settling on nothing in particular. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a simple black hoodie and jeans, the same uniform of survival he had worn when he first returned to school after that absence. The microphone adjusted itself to him. There was a slight crackle of static before the space fell silent. In that silence you could hear the weight of his story before he spoke. What followed was not a speech. It was a reckoning. In soft, steady narration, voices not quoted but described, he laid bare what it meant to be both invisible and hypervisible. The cafeteria nights when the fridge stayed empty, the nights at the hospital waiting while machines breathed for his mother, the chalkboard smirks in room 208, the ink-stained label of unexcused absence, the red marker as weapon, the laughter that echoed where compassion should have lived. He didn't raise his voice. His tone was calm, almost detached, but each word landed like a stone dropped on glass, cracking protective layers beneath. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't demand money. He asked for change. He asked for accountability. He asked for a world where no child had to choose between feeding a parent and attending class, where illness didn't automatically carry the stain of absenteeism, where schools recognized the humanity behind every empty desk. As he spoke, images projected behind him, his sketchbook drawings, the hospital bed, the empty kitchen, the distorted classroom, the silent figures in gowns. The crowd saw what so many adults chose to ignore. There were tears in the front rows. Journalists paused their typing. A hush settled over the room so heavy that you could hear the flutter of breathing. In a single moment, 30 years of ignored stories, of structural neglect, casual racism, bureaucratic blindness, felt seen. For the first time, a child's pain wasn't dismissed. A child's silence spoke. From the back row, Ms. Rachel Whitmore watched. Her posture was rigid, shoulders drawn tight, eyes fixed on Jonah's silhouette. The arrogance she once carried like armor was gone. Gone were the clipped tones, the red ink circles, the smirk that once echoed over a boy's absence. She watched him not as a teacher watching a student, but as a woman confronted with hers exposed beneath that spotlight. Her face betrayed something raw and unguarded. Shame, maybe grief, certainly regret. For the first time since this all began, she was no longer invisible. When Jonah finished, the auditorium stayed silent a beat too long, as though no one knew whether to breathe again. Then a ripple started, one sniffle, then another, then soft applause. It spread slowly, awkwardly, but with honesty. By the end it was standing. Reporters raised cameras, phones flashed. One by one, voices that seldom spoke for kids like Jonah whispered thanks. Applause became shouting, hands clapping, some wiping tears, others nodding hard, mouths set with new resolve. In the days that followed, the castle built on policies and silence began to crumble. A coalition of district leaders, civil rights attorneys, and grieving parents proposed a new legislative framework, a policy they named Jonah's Law. It mandated transparent tracking of student absences, with discretion for medical and familial emergencies, required schools to provide emergency support when a child cared for ill guardians, banned punitive labeling for unexcused absences without investigation, and created oversight committees, including student voices, parent independent advocates to ensure decisions weren't steered by bias or neglect. States across the nation watched. News outlets ran editorials. Education forums buzzed. Social media carried testimonies of other young people haunted by their own room 208 stories. Hunger, illness, grief, silent collapse. For some districts, Jonah's Law represented risk. For many, it was overdue truth. One by one, school boards started drafting adoption plans. Some modified existing policies. Others revoked strict unexcused absence penalties entirely. A few even issued apologies to past students who'd suffered similar fates. Back in his quiet hospital room, Jonah saw it all. On his phone screen, headlines scrolled. 13-year-old's testimony sparks nationwide reform. The sketchbook, once his only outlet, now rested beside his mother's bed like a ledger of change. He didn't feel proud. He felt steady, like someone who had moved through fire without burning, holding only scars as proof. His mother's breathing was slow but stable. The ventilator had been removed, replaced by oxygen tubes, then by shallow but independent breaths. She slept. He watched. He waited. But even as progress unfolded, a new fear crept in. Backlash. There were calls from some parents demanding the resignation of teachers. Legal suits filed against the district over public humiliation. Heated town hall debates. Social media threads accusing the system of being unfairly targeted. Anonymous threats. Denial. Some expressed sympathy. Others dismissed the reforms as overreach. Rumors spread that a few districts were planning to fight the law, to bury it in committees, to claim financial burden. The weight of hope pressed silently on Jonah's shoulder. Then came the twist no one saw coming. One evening, as Jonah checked hospital paperwork beside his mother's bed, a plain white envelope slipped under the hospital door. It was addressed to him personally. No header, no studio logos. Just his name in crisp block letters. He opened it slowly. Inside was an acceptance letter from a prestigious National Arts Academy, one he had applied to months ago, on a hopeful whim. The envelope bore their official seal. The letter congratulated him on his admission to their Young Artist program, offering a full scholarship, housing, mentorship, and a gallery show by next summer. But beyond the formal congratulations, there was a postscript. On behalf of the Academy, we commend your courage. We see you. It was signed not by a board, not by an administrator, but by someone whose name startled him, Marla Kincaid. The same superintendent who had once sat across a table offering strategic apologies. The same official who had threatened leave rather than acknowledge failure. Now, she was acknowledging him, recognizing him, inviting him to create, not under judgment, but under validation. Jonah stared at the signature. He felt the room shift again, not from scandal or shame, but from possibility, from an open door, from the knowledge that sometimes, the institutions built to silence you, could also be the ones who finally let you speak. His mother shifted in sleep, weak but breathing. The soft hum of machines had fallen away. In their place, hope pulsed quietly, steadily. Outside, the world reeled, debated, protested, rewrote. Inside, a boy sat with his sketchbook and the letter in his lap. A boy who had lost everything and was beginning to build something new. He closed the letter and traced the signature with a fingertip, as though reading the line aloud. We see you. In that moment, he realized this was more than a scholarship. It was a reckoning and a promise. Jonah gets accepted into an elite art program, and the letter is signed by someone unexpected. If this story broke something open in you, even just a little, don't let it fade when the video ends. Type yes in the comments if you believe no child should ever suffer in silence. What would you have done if you were in Jonah's place? Subscribe if you believe stories like his deserve to be seen, heard, and never forgotten. Because until justice is the default, we can't stop telling the truth.